Before we start, I just want to say a massive thank you to Michael Peasy at Vibes and Horizons on Instagram for letting me use a bunch of his amazing dive videography in this video. Most of what you're going to see is his footage, and he didn't ask me to, but I will quickly plug his company, Apex Ocean Travel. They're a dive travel agency that takes people all over the world on incredible dive trips. I was just on a trip with them to Moorea, French Polynesia, had one of the most incredible weeks of my life diving with the humpbacks there. It was amazing. And actually, Michael is on a trip to Antarctica at this very moment, making me insanely jealous with all of his Instagram stories. So yeah, check him out. Michael Peasy, Vibes and Horizons, Apex Ocean Travel. You won't be disappointed. Thanks, dude. All right, let's get to it. At a moment when marine life is declining across the open ocean, the rules for governing nearly 2/3 of it have just fundamentally changed in favor of conservation. That change arrived on January 17th, 2026, when the UN High Seas Treaty formally entered into force. For decades, the biological fate of the open ocean, marine areas beyond national jurisdiction, has been shaped by fragmented governance rather than ecosystem-scale conservation. The treaty, formerly known as the Agreement on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, is the first global framework designed to address that gap. My name is Chris Scanlon. I'm a professional wildlife biologist with degrees in biology and sustainability. In this episode, I want to explain what just happened, why it matters biologically, and how we should judge whether this treaty actually changes outcomes for marine biodiversity or if it just ends up being something that looks good on paper. So here's the structure. I'll begin with how the treaty moved from negotiation to entry into force. Then I'll lay out the current state and trajectory of marine biodiversity on the high seas, because that context defines the stakes. From there, I'll explain why the high seas matter ecologically, how human pressures operate in these systems, what the treaty's tools can realistically change, and what to watch for next as implementation begins. Negotiations for the High Seas Treaty stretched across nearly 2 decades. The agreement was adopted by consensus in 2023 and opened for signature that same year, signaling political support but not yet legal commitment. Each country still had to complete its own domestic ratification process. The treaty was written to enter into force 120 days after the 60th ratification. Morocco became the 60th country to ratify on September 19, 2025, setting the clock. 120 days later, on January 17, 2026, the treaty became legally active. Its entry into force establishes the first comprehensive framework intended to manage conservation and environmental impacts in marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. These areas make up roughly 64% of the ocean and close to half the Earth's surface. Until now, they have been governed primarily through sector-specific bodies like fisheries organizations, shipping authorities, and seabed institutions, without any mechanism to evaluate cumulative impacts or plan conservation at ecosystem scale. That absence has had biological consequences. Despite their size and ecological importance, less than 1% of the high seas has any formal spatial protection. Many marine species spend large portions of their lives in international waters, using them as feeding grounds, migratory corridors, or developmental habitat. Mortality and disturbance in these regions therefore accumulate across entire life cycles, even when coastal waters or breeding sites are protected. In that sense, the long-standing lack of coordinated high seas governance has functioned as a persistent source of cumulative pressure rather than a neutral absence of management. Population data from the past several decades show that this pressure has coincided with substantial declines across multiple marine taxa. One of the clearest global signals comes from oceanic sharks and rays. A large synthesis published in Nature estimated that their combined abundance declined by approximately 71% between 1970 and 2018, driven primarily by an 18-fold or 1,800% increase in fishing pressure over the same period. These species are highly migratory and spend much of their time in international waters, where cumulative exposure to fishing mortality has historically been difficult to limit. Their life histories of slow growth, late maturity, and low reproductive output mean that recovery from depletion is prolonged once populations are reduced. Large predatory marine fishes show a parallel pattern. Reconstructions of historical abundance indicate that populations of tunas, billfishes, and other large predatory fishes were reduced by roughly 70 to 90% relative to pre-industrial levels across much of the global ocean by the late 20th century. Although rates of decline have slowed in some regions, most populations remain far below historical abundance and exhibit truncated size and age structure. That truncation matters biologically because older, larger individuals contribute disproportionately to reproduction and population stability. When those age classes are lost, populations become less resilient to environmental variability, even if fishing pressure later declines. Pelagic seabirds illustrate how high seas pressure translates directly into demographic risk. Global analyses of longline fisheries estimate that between 160,000 and 320,000 seabirds are killed each year as bycatch. Many affected species are long-lived and reproduce slowly, often producing only a single chick per breeding cycle. Sustained adult mortality at this scale is sufficient to drive population declines even when nesting colonies are protected on land. Among albatrosses, one of the most ocean-dependent bird groups, conservation status reflects this pressure starkly. Of the 22 recognized species, only one is listed as least concern, while the rest are classified as near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. Marine turtles show a similar dependence on open ocean habitats. Of the 7 recognized marine turtle species, 6 are listed globally as threatened or critically endangered. Juveniles of several species spend years to decades in pelagic environments, and adults migrate thousands of kilometers through international waters. Global syntheses estimate that hundreds of thousands of marine turtles are caught annually as bycatch, primarily in pelagic longline and gillnet fisheries. For long-lived species with delayed maturity, sustained bycatch mortality at these levels can prevent population recovery even when nesting beaches are protected. One recent exception, the downlisting of the green sea turtle from endangered to least concern in parts of its range, underscores the rule rather than contradicting it, reflecting decades of targeted protection rather than reduced pressure across the high seas as a whole. Cetaceans illustrate a different but equally important pattern. Commercial whaling reduced many large whale populations by 70 to 90% relative to pre-industrial abundance, establishing historically depleted baselines that still shape population trajectories today. Although some baleen whale populations have shown partial recovery since the end of industrial whaling, many cetaceans remain far below historical levels and continue to experience cumulative pressure across their migratory ranges. For most species, population dynamics are now shaped less by direct harvest and more by basin-scale exposure to ship strikes, chronic noise, entanglement in fishing gear, and climate-driven shifts in prey distribution. Baleen whales typically migrate between low-latitude breeding areas and high-latitude feeding grounds that extend into the high seas, while odontocytes such as sperm whales and beaked whales forage across deep pelagic and abyssal habitats beyond national jurisdiction. Climate change adds another layer of stress to these already altered systems. The ocean has absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat generated by anthropogenic warming and approximately 1/4 of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. Warming, stratification, and deoxygenation alter productivity patterns, compress habitable depth ranges, and reshape species distributions. In the open ocean, where ecological processes already operate at large spatial scales, climate-driven change interacts with and often amplifies the effects of exploitation and disturbance rather than replacing them. Together, these observations describe the biological context in which the High Seas Treaty has taken effect. The treaty does not reverse declines or restore ecosystems by its existence alone. Instead, it introduces a mechanism through which states may attempt to reduce cumulative mortality, limit irreversible habitat loss, and coordinate management across the largest and least regulated part of the ocean. Whether it alters the trajectory of marine life will depend on how its tools intersect with the ecological realities of scale, mobility, and long recovery times. Why the high seas matter ecologically becomes clearer when we examine how these systems function. Marine areas beyond national jurisdiction are dominated by pelagic and deep-sea ecosystems structured by physical circulation rather than proximity to land. Productivity in the open ocean is generally lower than in coastal upwelling systems, but it is unevenly distributed. Ocean fronts, eddies, and convergence zones concentrate nutrients and plankton, creating recurring biological hotspots that support higher trophic levels. Although these features shift in space and time, they often reform seasonally, making them predictable feeding areas for mobile predators across large regions of the ocean. Energy flow through these systems depends on coupling between surface production and deeper waters. The mesopelagic zone, roughly 200 to 1,000 meters below the surface, contains large biomasses of fishes, squids, and zooplankton that migrate vertically each day. These daily movements transfer organic carbon from surface waters to depth, contributing to the biological carbon pump and supporting higher trophic levels. While estimates of mesopelagic biomass vary due to sampling limitations, even conservative assessments place global biomass on the order of billions of metric tons, underscoring the importance of both pelagic food webs and climate regulation. Across the high seas, many of the taxa most central to conservation outcomes share a common ecological structure. They are wide-ranging, long-lived, and dependent on conditions encountered across entire ocean basins. Large predatory fishes, oceanic sharks and rays, pelagic seabirds, whales, and marine turtles all move across thousands of kilometers in response to shifting prey fields and physical features. Tracking studies show that many species in these groups spend more than half of their lives in waters beyond national jurisdiction, crossing multiple management regions within just a single year. For these taxa, connectivity has direct demographic consequences. Survival and reproductive success are shaped by cumulative exposure to mortality and disturbance along migratory routes, rather than by conditions within any single jurisdiction. Mortality from fishing gear, bycatch, ship strikes, prey limitation, or other pressures in the high seas can constrain population recovery even where coastal protections or breeding site management are strong. Because many of these species are characterized by late maturity, long generation times, and low reproductive rates, relatively small increases in adult or subadult mortality are sufficient to shift populations from stability to long-term decline. Below the pelagic zone, deep-sea ecosystems introduce a different but complementary form of vulnerability. Seamounts, abyssal plains, and continental slopes support communities characterized by slow growth, extreme longevity, limited dispersal, and high levels of endemism. Cold-water corals found on seamounts include individuals thousands of years old, with growth rates measured in millimeters per year or less. These corals create complex three-dimensional habitats that support diverse and often highly specialized communities. But once damaged, recovery occurs over centuries to millennia, if it occurs at all. Abyssal plains are often dotted with polymetallic nodules that provide hard substrate and habitat structure for uniquely adapted invertebrate communities. These nodules accrete at rates of millimeters per million years, making them effectively non-renewable resources on any conservation-relevant timescale. Experimental disturbance studies in nodule-bearing regions have shown little to no biological recovery after 30 to 40 years, indicating that both habitat structure and associated biodiversity recover extremely slowly, if at all. High levels of endemism and evolutionary distinctiveness mean that species lost from these habitats are often irreplaceable, representing unique genetic lineages with no functional analogs elsewhere in the ocean. Human pressures in the high seas translate into biological harm through a limited number of mechanisms that operate repeatedly across space and time. Industrial fishing remains the dominant source of direct biomass removal in pelagic systems. Sustained harvest reduces population abundance while selectively removing larger and older individuals, simplifying age and size structure. Bycatch adds a parallel source of mortality affecting seabirds, sharks, rays, turtles, and marine mammals. For cetaceans, assessments compiled by the International Whaling Commission estimate that more than 300,000 whales, dolphins, and porpoises are killed annually through entanglement and other forms of fisheries bycatch worldwide. Shipping introduces diffuse but persistent pressures across large areas of the ocean. Vessel strikes cause direct mortality in whales, particularly along migratory routes and in regions of dense traffic. Because many struck animals sink or are never detected, observed carcasses substantially underestimate true mortality. Syntheses of observations and risk models suggest that ship strikes likely killed 20,000 to 30,000 whales annually. In deep sea environments, human activities produce a qualitatively different form of impact. Bottom contact fishing and proposed seabed mining physically remove habitat structures that form over geological timescales. The defining feature of these impacts is irreversibility on human timescales. Unlike many coastal systems, deep-sea habitats often lack realistic recovery pathways once physical structure is removed. So what does the High Sea Treaty actually change? Until its entry into force, there was no comprehensive mechanism for conserving biodiversity in marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. Although individual activities were regulated through separate international bodies, no institution had the authority to evaluate cumulative impacts across sectors or to designate conservation measures at ecosystem scale. Even where political will existed, there was no shared process through which states could collectively establish protected areas, require environmental review of new activities, or coordinate conservation actions across the open ocean. The treaty changes that governance landscape by creating a formal framework through which states can propose, evaluate, and adopt conservation measures for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. It establishes processes for designating marine protected areas and other area-based management tools, requires environmental impact assessments for activities that may cause harm, and promotes cooperation, data sharing, and capacity building to support implementation. Importantly, it does not mandate outcomes, but it provides infrastructure through which outcomes may become possible. The conservation relevance of these tools depends on whether they reduce cumulative pressure or prevent irreversible loss. Marine protected areas matter biologically only if they are placed where ecological value is concentrated and impose restrictions strong enough to reduce mortality or disturbance. Given that less than 1% of the high seas is currently protected, even modest expansion of well-designed, enforced protection would represent a measurable shift. Environmental impact assessments matter most where activities threaten permanent habitat loss. In such cases, the primary conservation outcome is avoidance rather than mitigation. Assessing success therefore requires attention to observable signals rather than formal milestones. Are protected areas being proposed in ecologically meaningful places? Are environmental impact assessments explicitly accounting for irreversibility and uncertainty? Are bycatch rates declining? Are population declines slowing in long-lived species? These are all critical questions. Substantial constraints remain. Enforcement in international waters is difficult, capacities are uneven, and data gaps persist. Even where protections are effective, biological responses may lag for decades. The treaty's first Conference of the Parties, expected later this year, will clarify how its processes operate in practice. Participation will matter, creating incentives for additional countries to ratify before the meeting. Scientific institutions and conservation organizations are already compiling data on biologically important areas to inform future proposals. The high seas are defined by scale, connectivity, and deep time. The treaty creates a framework through which governance may begin to reflect those realities. Its value will be judged not by its legal novelty, but by whether it measurably reduces mortality, prevents irreversible habitat loss, and alters long-term biological trajectories in the largest shared ecosystem on Earth. All right, that is the UN High Seas Treaty and its biological and ecological implications. What do you guys think? Will it be a success? Will we see reductions in bycatch and ship strikes? Will we see the creation of new marine protected areas? That's one of the things I'll be keeping an eye out for. If the goal of achieving 30% protection of the high seas by 2030 is to be met, we're going to be needing to see a lot of bold proposals sooner rather than later. And if that happens, you best believe that I'll be talking about it. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.